Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and today we are going to be revisiting a movement that has been spoken about in quite some depth on the podcast before, but we are going to be diving into a different perspective today. And I'm so happy to welcome to the show, Jay. Hello, Jay.
Hello, Kacey. Thank you for having me on your show today.
Thank you for sending me such wonderful in-depth notes about your experiences. I'm really looking forward to gaining this new perspective today on a group that we have spoken about quite a lot, but there is a bit more interest from the wider public, I would say, in terms of what this group is, what they practice. I know that there are certain high-profile celebrities that talk about their involvement. So today we're going to be talking about Soka Gakkai International.
Yes, I was part of the organization from age 4 up until about the age of maybe 27 years old. And I got into this group because my mother was already involved in it quite heavily. And this would have been when, I think about maybe 15 years after she arrived from Japan as a new immigrant. She had married my father in Japan originally, and they decided to move to Canada as my father was already a Canadian citizen. And they got married there, and they had my brother and I here in Canada. And she started practicing I call it a pseudo-religion for many reasons, which we'll get into. But she started practicing with this organization, SGI Canada. I think it was 4 years before I was actually born. So by the time I was 4 years old, she was already taking me to their meetings, their so-called Buddhist meetings, and exposing me to their practices, normally chanting and discussion meetings and studying an organizational publication, which was called the World Tribune at that time. And it was based on Nichiren Shoshu's teachings, which was from Nichiren Shoshu, the Buddha, the original Buddha, that they claimed they were taking the teachings of, which is partially true. However, as I got older and I started to realize that there was something very wrong within the organization and its teachings, that I finally decided to leave in my mid-20s.
Your mum becoming involved in SGI after she'd moved over to Canada, was this in your knowledge, like something she was using to like meet new people, or was it in line with her beliefs and practices that she held when she was still living in Japan?
That's an excellent question, Kacey. My mother was raised in a very large family. Her family was very well off. She was born into an ancient aristocratic family back home, and her parents were Buddhists, actually. My grandfather, my maternal grandfather, was practicing Zen Buddhism at the time, and his wife, my grandmother, was into Shinto, which is the sort of nationalistic Buddhist religion at that time. So my mother was raised in sort of a Buddhist spiritual setting, although her parents didn't force her into practicing anything with them. And when she came to Canada, she said she didn't know a word of English. So she met up with a group of women who were meeting at some other woman's house on a regular basis. And she sort of got pulled in because these women were both English-speaking and Japanese-speaking as well. That is my background. And they were very friendly with her, and they invited her to the meetings. They invited her to their homes for dinners and for different parties, social activities, because she was very lost without her family. She was the only one of her family of 6 children who decided to immigrate at that time. So she was lonely, she felt isolated, and I guess they sort of extended themselves outwards to her as an extended family, I guess.
Yeah, I can absolutely see the appeal behind moving somewhere completely new, but also finding something slightly familiar in a group like SGI, which kind of has like a Buddhist westernized blend going on. It's very popular in more of the westernized parts of the world. And that's why there are things like SGI Canada, SGI USA, which is the chapter that Orlando Bloom is associated with and spends a lot of time talking about his hero and his mentor, Daisaku Ikeda, which I always find really interesting.
Yeah.
But that is maybe a conversation for later on or another day. Today, we're talking about you, Jay, and I would like to know if you can describe to us some of your earliest memories attending SGI events.
Oh, that's a very vivid memory for me because I was sort of, I guess, dragged into it by Mom. I wasn't asked if I wanted to go with her. It was actually expected of me to go with her. Now, I have to mention that I have an older brother who is quite a bit older than I. So he, being the male child of the family, was given more say as to whether he wanted to do things or not. Because being a patriarchal sort of society, if you have a male son who's the eldest, well, he has a lot more power in the family. And then being the only girl and then the youngest out of two, it was just expected that I was to be a lot more submissive and to basically be told what you're done. Because part of the Japanese old school way of thinking is that women are supposed to be gentler and a lot more submissive, especially to their parents. And I have to also say that my father had no interest in joining the SGI at all at that time. He basically said, you do what you do and I'll do what I do. He said, I don't agree with what the teachings are. And he said, I'll drive you to the meetings because my mother never learned how to drive a car, unfortunately. So he had to take her to the meetings all the time and pick us up and drive us home. And there were 2 or 3 meetings per week. It was quite an active sort of a group here. And at first, when I heard the chanting at the meeting, I thought it was very strange. I thought it was very, it made me sleepy. I remember feeling very sleepy as a child at that age, in grade school, and wondering what people were doing. And then after the chanting stopped, people were just saying, hi, how are you? And introducing themselves, etc. And then having talks, right? They were talking about the religion itself and what they were doing. And there were lots of study meetings, they called them. So study meetings were like once a week usually. General meetings were twice a week. And then they'd have special occasion meetings on Sunday mornings quite early at 9 a.m. And I remember just having to go with Mom all the time. She was really trying to, I guess, make me join this organization with her because Dad and my older brother they were not, she said to me that they were not spiritual, but I think they were later on in hindsight. I think they were actually very smart.
So when you were going to these meetings and hearing this chanting, how many people do you think were in attendance roughly at these meetings, and what was the environment like?
Well, it was always held in a leader's home, and the chapter leader at that time was an elderly Japanese woman, Mrs. F, I'll call her, and she was the one that, I guess, started SGI in the city, my home city here, many, many years ago. And so she had the meetings at her home, and then other group leaders also invited people to their homes for meetings. So it was like a homey sort of a setting. In that way, it was kind of, I guess it was an easy way to sort of pull people in who were feeling kind of lost. Because I remember as an elementary school student that I noticed people there that were looking for something in their lives. They were directionless and looking for something to make them feel more secure and happier. Those people were very attracted to this home setting, I would say.
Sound cozy and it does sound homely. I wonder the level of pressure and stress that the hosts would feel knowing that everybody was coming round to their home for a service. Do you remember that ever playing a part in any of these home services?
Yes, I remember a husband and wife leadership team. They were both local leaders, and I remember that the wife of this couple, the spouse, the female spouse, she was very nervous about having meetings at her home, and they lived in a small home at the time when they first started having meetings at their house. But I think they were under pressure as a couple because all of a sudden the husband decided to build a much larger house in the middle of the street where they lived. And it didn't fit in with the other houses at all. It was considerably a lot larger. It was fancier and it was extremely modern. So it really, really stuck out on this street. And they'd spent all of their savings that they had in building this new meeting house because I think they felt pressured to having a better and a larger home in order to accommodate more people. Because when I was a child, I remember meetings being quite small, like they would be attended by maybe 15 people at the time. And then as I was getting a little bit older in grade school age, it was increasing at that time. I would say 20 or more people at a time. And this poor couple, because of the financial pressure of having to build this bigger home to have more people attend the meetings, the husband ended up taking a part-time job beside his full-time executive type job, delivering newspapers really early in the morning with his son. So I could see the pressure there, and there was some marital stuff going on between this couple as well that may not want to mention here, but I really noticed it as I got older and that they were pressured into having as many people over as possible. And I
Yeah.
guess they had to make it look kind of exclusive or special in a way so that people would be attracted to their home because it was so beautiful inside.
Yeah, absolutely. And almost
Yeah.
like building like a community space, much less a home, but more a gathering place for everybody to get together by the sounds of things.
Oh, yes, because it was large. It was 2 stories and it must have been close to 2,000 square feet, really. It was quite a large home.
Yes. Gosh. Wait, your mum, by the time you were 4 years old, she'd been in SGI for around
Mhm.
8 years. So is she
Yeah.
in any type of leadership position at this point?
I remember when I was in grade school, probably around the age of 12, she was appointed the chapter treasurer. So she was in charge of all the financials and the financial interactions in the group. So that would be taking money for the monthly magazine publications by SGI International, the Japanese version of the study materials, which was called the Daibyaku Renge at that time. And she was collecting the monies also for donations from the members. So she had to keep track of everything like an accountant would. And because my mother was very mathematically oriented, she was very good at this job. But of course, it was voluntary and I remember it took up, quite a few hours every week because she would be sitting at home at night at her desk at home, with these books at the time. Everything was on paper back then. And she was putting in numbers and writing people's names. And she had this big ledger that she had to keep everything separate with all the different publications, the Japanese, the English ones, and any special World Peace Day donations, which was in May, June usually, where the members were strongly encouraged to put out extra donations towards the SGI and its growth.
I imagine there might have been some tension if your mum had been a leader and had been expected to host gatherings at your home where your brother and your dad were explicitly uninterested.
Yes, yes. I remember my brother getting into an argument with my mother several times as I was growing up, and he was telling her, "No, I'm not interested in this." He says, "I'm not spiritual." He said, I don't want to be part of this group. And I think on quite a few occasions, I would hear him say that very, very clearly. And my dad would sometimes just sort of put it away from discussion. He would say, we've talked about this many, many times before. He says, I don't want to attend. He says, I feel very uncomfortable being there with all these people, and I don't believe in what they believe in. He says, I honestly think they're doing the wrong thing. And he explicitly told her that. So I remember hearing that on occasion as well.
It's got to be hard for your mum feeling so tied to this group and having spent so many of her years integrating herself into this group, to then be told by her son that he thinks it's wrong and that she shouldn't be a part of it. What's also interesting, though, is that your mum decides to say that he's just not spiritual. And I wonder if she's come to that conclusion, or if that's just what she's been told by other people in SGI.
Right. I think my mother believed she was spiritual, but personally, she was diagnosed later in the early 90s by a therapist as being narcissistically personality disordered. So I always wondered why she was very controlling. And then she also belonged to this very high control pseudo-religious group. And she was very controlling at home. And my mother's behavior was very different in front of people in public, especially at the meetings, than how she behaved towards us in the home. So that's another point altogether, but I think it's all tied in together. I always wondered why I was always clashing with my mother constantly as a child, and especially as a teenager, because, you know, when you're 15 or 16, you get rather mouthy and you start discovering really who you are. And you start expressing your opinions more. And I have a strong personality to begin with. So it was very, very high tension in the house because of that. And she was trying desperately, in my view, to become a happier person. And unfortunately, throughout her entire life, I'd never seen that actually happen. She was really grasping onto this Buddhist organization and their teachings and this glorification of President Daisaku Ikeda, the most, I guess, the last real president of the SGI. She was so fanatical about reaching her enlightenment and being happier and having more things go her way, that I think being part of this high control organization actually was comfortable for her, because she was like that at home. She was very controlling. I mean, I was told a lot of different things that today would be considered really disrespectful, outrageous, and extremely politically incorrect when I was growing up in the organization. And I actually met President Ikeda myself. Our group leaders had an arrangement. There was this really huge community center that was built in Caledon Hills in Ontario at that time, and it was worth millions and millions of dollars. And the SGI Canada was fighting to get this huge community worship temple built there. And the residents of that area were wealthy, well-to-do, affluent people. And SGI was trying to get zoning regulations in order to build this huge community center that would be SGI Canada's headquarters at that time in the late 80s, 1987. And I remember the group leaders saying that they were getting a lot of pushback from the residents in that neighborhood because they didn't want a so-called cult coming into their area and taking over the entire residential area.
Yeah. Good for them in kind of putting up a fight in getting that community center built, because sometimes when these groups, cults and organizations have so much money under their belts, you know, which they've gathered from the many people that are members of the cult, they're able to really kind of do what they want. And sometimes it doesn't require building a new building, but just acquiring loads of real estate in the area that they're interested in, as we know from Scientology.
Yes, that's a very excellent example. That's a very good parallel, actually, Kacey. It really is. I remember also being pressured, like my mother was under pressure to give money all the time. And every month they had a monthly, I guess, collection or a stipend, I would call it. It was called zaimu in Japanese. And zaimu translates to devotion, the word devotion in English. Very ironic, isn't it? So anyway, because of the pressure to donate, my mother decided to take a full-time job when she was in her, I guess, in her 30s and onwards up until 65, her retirement age. So she ended up managing a department in a very large department store here in the city where we live. And she did very well at her job. She did so well that she was actually became a supervisor in her department. And whatever money she made, I remember her donating it, a lot of it, to the organization. And there was a lot of pressure. Like they didn't hand out plates or anything at every meeting, that sort of thing. But it was very cleverly sort of put out to the members at regular meetings, like which were 2 to 3 times a week, which I thought was outrageous. It was so much time that people were expected to put into this organization and their so-called practice, I call it, that it created, I'm sure, a lot of stress on a lot of the members. I remember when I was quitting at that time, I'd seen about probably a good 20% of the membership locally where I live. They also quit too. They just gradually left, or they just outrightly left at that time. And I know that my mother was giving probably 30% of our family income at that time between mom and dad to the organization. That's quite a lot of money when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. And when you consider that some of the members of SGI will be very affluent members of society, or kind of like Hollywood heartthrobs like Orlando Bloom, for example, then some of the money that they are going to be collecting will be substantial and significant amounts that I'm sure are stored away in various bank accounts to buy up real estate or to fund the lavish lifestyle of a leader who may or may not be dead at this point. You mentioned that you met Daisaku Ikeda.
Yeah.
Not many recent SGI members can say that, because apparently he was alive and well, but nobody had seen him for a very, very long time. So
there's a reason for that. I found out through my mom in later years, right, that President Ikeda actually had a series of major strokes as he got older. I believe he was a narcissistic leader himself, because there was so little emphasis on the actual teachings of Nichiren Buddha, the original Buddha, and it was more about glorifying Daisaku Ikeda himself. I think he was seen as an icon. Like, I remember growing up and hearing weird things from the members. They would say things like, oh, President Ikeda is like the modern day reincarnation of the original, Shakyamuni Buddha, they call them, right? And there was a Shakyamuni Buddha a long, like thousands of years ago in India, and that was his Sanskrit name. And so they believed, I don't know who started this rumor, but I remember at every meeting I attended, whether it was locally or in Ontario where the headquarters is located, that, oh, President Ikeda is like, he's been reincarnated from the original Buddha and he's here to sort of save everybody now, to get them to practice the only religion, the only true religion of the world, so that people could attain enlightenment and Buddhahood and become eternally happy and live forever. And I thought, when I met him, I thought, he looks like an ordinary guy to me, although, because he's driven around in a big stretch limo and wears Savile Row suits, I'm sure he's quite well off. And I was wondering about that as a teenager. I thought, like, okay, Mom, where's all this money going to, right? And I'd ask the leaders. So when I was at meetings and I was starting to get older as a teenager and as a young adult, I was asking too many questions, it's called, right? So in a high control organization like this, when you ask too many questions, you are told in front of the other members at these regular, like, house meetings, we'll address that issue later in private.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. So just kind of like terminating the conversation right there.
Yes, that's right. And then when you were taken aside in private afterwards with one of your leaders, superior leaders, I called them, you were told to, that's not really appropriate to question that, or you need to see a senior leader in the women's division in order to get guidance from them. It's called guidance. So whenever you had doubts or you had questions about anything going on within the organization, you were told privately to get guidance. And guidance, I found out, it's also a form of brainwashing. It's an appeasement in order to get you to sort of calm down and accept what's already being done. And they put it in such a way that it's so generalized that you feel like your question was not truly answered to that point. And I would just say, well, I don't agree with this. I once requested, okay, I think there should be monthly reports to the members, because if this is a real religious organization, I think that, and it's registered as such, and they're not paying taxes, and that's where a lot of money came from as well, a monthly report to the members, right? That should be something that's open and transparent. If people are giving all this money every month to the organization, you should know where it's going to and what it's being used for, right? Something basic like that.
Yeah, just transparency at all levels, really, because otherwise, what do you have to hide? And responses like, well, that's not really your position to know, or we don't ask questions like that, then, it's like, but why? Why don't we? And if you get into trouble for questioning things, then that is, a red flag and something that is not going to, for an inquisitive, or as you said earlier, mouthy person, a mouthy young person who's kind of coming into her rebellious stage, it's not going to be enough to say you need to seek guidance and then you go, oh, okay, then I guess that answers my question. Like, that's just not going to be enough.
Exactly. And as I got older and, turned 18 and got a little bit older, and by the way, I was appointed a young women's division leader at that time as soon as I turned 18, and I was wary about that. And then my mother said, no, this is a real honor. It's like, you should be honored that, the Toronto headquarters leaders want you to be this, because you've been practicing since you were 4, and you know lots about the teachings and things, that you should be trying to bring in more younger women into the organization, right? Into the group. So I was put under pressure to do that. And I did it reluctantly. And especially as time went on, I was actually one of the youngest young women in the entire chapter where I live. And so what happened to me during that appointment was I was holding one meeting every week at one of our homes, not just ours, though, because, of course, my dad and my brother were not comfortable with that. So we would have to meet at other members' houses once a week in order to conduct these young women's division meetings. And we would do all the chanting and then have a meeting and talk about different things as young women. But you know what happened? Bullied by the other young women's division members in this group, because they were all older than I was at the time. They were in their mostly late 80s to mid-80s. And their complaint to the head leadership at the time was, well, she doesn't know enough about life because she's only 18 and she's in university right now. And we don't think we should follow somebody that is that young.
Okay, that's really interesting for several reasons. First of all, it's not very supportive of women in terms of women supporting women. But typically you do find in these types of exploitative and destructive groups that there isn't really outwardly, there's lots of messages of love and support. And then inwardly, actually, it just turns into a lot of judgment and isolation, and just people being very spiteful and nasty. Second of all, if you've been in SGI, like some of these women, I imagine, for really long periods of time, then you are also not as worldly experienced as maybe somebody that's never been in SGI, because so much of your life and your time is expected to be dedicated to this organization. Lots of different things we can pick apart. And obviously, I'm just feeling a bit defensive for you because I don't like that that's the response that was given and not like, oh, yeah, let's all work together and empower each other.
Yes, which is what I wanted because I'm a very harmony-oriented person. I'm a people person and I wanted to do my best, for the group, right? But I was met with so much resistance from women who were older than I was at that time. And you're right, being raised in such a controlled, almost militant environment was so inappropriate for me as a human being, in general, because I'm very freedom oriented as a person anyway, that no wonder my mother and I were clashing all the time at home. And I became this punk rocker in my later teens. I even joined a punk rock band and I was super rebellious. Like I had purple hair and all the makeup and all the clothes and everything. And people were just looking like me like, oh my God, what happened to her? What happened to her? Right? So the members were worried about this, and I was given these guidance talks too from older women in the organization. And I just kind of looked at them and I said, look, I said, if I'm not allowed to be myself as a human being, I said, then why am I part of this? Because I said, obviously, you're not doing it. I see so much control and patriarchy, especially in this group. I grew up in the 80s as a teenager, and so to me, this was awful. It's like women's rights were really becoming a lot stronger at that time. It was starting to be more in the open on an international level, and I thought, hey, this is great. It's like, because the way I was raised, it's like you have to respect your elders, especially the men, right? And then I'd say, well, what if the men are wrong? It's like, what if I don't agree with what they're saying? And this was an issue for me, right? And then when I met President Ikeda, I was 15 years old, Kacey. And at this huge headquarters meeting out in Caledon Hills in Ontario, I was told to sit down beside President Ikeda. His wife was sitting behind him, which I thought was kind of odd. Like she should be maybe sitting beside him instead of behind him. I thought that looked kind of weird, right? And then the advice he gave me was so eye-opening in a way, because when I sat down, he was very kind. He gave me some gifts from, I guess it came from the organization's money, collected by the members. And he gave me these beautiful little trinkets. And I said, thank you, President Ikeda. Then he was giving me guidance himself. And you know what he said to me, Kacey? This blew my mind. Even as a 15-year-old, he said to me, he said, Jay, he said, you're a very beautiful girl. You've got lots of Buddha nature. And he said, you're very enlightened as a person. However, and this was what the translator said, of course, because he spoke mostly Japanese and very little English. He said to me, but you're very, very strong inside. And he says, you're going to have trouble finding a husband for you.
Great.
And I looked at him and I was speechless.
No.
Like, I thought, like, wow, like, how can you say that to a young...
That makes my butt cheeks clench. That makes me so uncomfortable. Like, maybe...
I looked at him, all I did was smile and I just thanked him. And then I said to my mother, who was, of course, beside me, and she was like all gaga over this because, like, my daughter is so special because she gets to meet President Ikeda and all the Winnipeg chapter members are watching this because she's special. And I'm sure her narcissism like got a huge feed of energy from that, right?
Gosh.
Oh my gosh. So I was like flabbergasted. I was trying not to show my emotions, right? Because at that time I was still underage and it was like I was still kind of obedient to some extent, right? But I thought, like, my mind was racing at that time, and I thought inwardly, how can anybody say that to another person? It's like he's a man and I'm a young woman and I'm under 18, and he's basically telling me two things. Basically, if you're a strong person, you're unacceptable as a woman, first of all. And then second of all, you have to get married to a man, and a man will find you unacceptable if you are your own person and have your own opinions.
Yeah.
So
I don't
I
know
was
if
like,
he's been told like about your rebellious nature and they're trying to use this as a way to like kind of
to
rein you in a
control me.
bit. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. I mean,
Because
it's
I guess people were noticing that, Jay is not really falling in line with what we want her to behave like and act like. And I actually quit being the young women's leader, I guess, when I was about maybe 19 or 20, because I felt like this does not resonate with me. I feel like I'm going against my true nature as a person. And I cannot be telling women that are my age and older the things that I've been told to tell them. I thought it was not right. I thought it was very militant. It was sexist at that time, I thought already. I thought this is not a way to treat other women, and I cannot continue doing this in this capacity. It was just wrong to me.
it makes me wonder as well, how many other children were you around when not just kind of from the age of 4 when you were doing the home visits, but throughout your tenure within SGI, were you noticing that there were other children similar in age to you?
No.
Were you kind of like, because most of the people I've interviewed are
Yeah.
adults that were recruited into SGI, young adults and onwards, not really people raised in the group by their parents or parent.
Exactly. No, I guess I was born in a year where there were no children of my age in the group at all. And I remember this throughout my entire time in the SGI here. I was one of the older children always. The other children were at least 5 or more years younger than I was at the time. So I didn't really fit anywhere, I remembered. I remembered being, 12 or 13, and other kids were like really little. They were in like kindergarten to elementary school age at the time, running around at the meetings and their parents telling them to behave properly and to be quiet. I was really taken aback by how controlling this organization was towards children, little children. Like, you can't expect kids that age to sit quietly and to sit still for that long throughout the meetings. Like, the meetings were about 2 hours long each time. And I thought, like, they should have like a separate area where children can play with, with some of the adults, in supervision aside. Like children should not be expected to be listening to all the chanting and then chanting themselves, like expected to behave like the other adults when they're really small like that at that age. It doesn't fit. And I remember like getting really sleepy during chanting as a young kid, and also, in my teens and everything, because I was going to school full time and getting good grades and doing, things that I thought were normal at that time. But later on, when I look back at my childhood, I figured that everything was really mostly closely involved with the organization itself. Attending so many meetings, like this was taking up like 8 or 9 hours of my week every week. And so I also had to study as a student, and I had friends, but as time went on and I got older, I was discouraged from hanging out with kids who were not members of the SGI. Like, you shouldn't really be too involved with other kids. It was just sort of like this underlying dynamic of control in that aspect as well. So when other girls were like having sleepover parties at their house, or going to school dances and things like that, I was strongly discouraged from doing those things. My mom didn't even allow me to go to like girls' birthday parties where the girls all slept over at another girl's house. I was not allowed to do that. And as I got older, this idea of me trying to find a husband by the time I was 25 years old, and it was also strongly encouraged that I not date or marry any non-SGI boys or young men at all. They said it was easier for everybody in their journey of enlightenment to marry within the group or date within the group itself. And I saw all these couples, dating couples, and people getting married by arrangement. Can you believe that? In the 80s and 90s? A lot of the couples that were leaders in our chapter here where I live, they were married to each other, and they were not people that you would expect to be either dating or married to each other. I think behind the scenes, Kacey, people were sort of put together. Do you know what I mean? They were put together as a couple so that, they could continue on the organizational structure and try to get more people to join and have meetings at their houses, that sort of thing. Because I'll give you a good example, okay? I knew a girl in my group who was gay, okay? And she came out when she was 15, and I loved her. I mean, I thought she was my best friend in the group, and I thought she was a great person. And there was a man she brought into the group, a part of the gay community at that time where I lived, and they were actually sort of made to marry each other.
Oh, gosh. Oh.
And I was like horrified by that. I looked at my friend and I said, oh my gosh, I said, they can't expect a gay man and a gay woman to marry each other for an image of being a couple. This is outrageous. I thought it was evil, actually. It's like, they're not allowing you to be yourselves and live your lives the way you should be living them. And it's like, I was really offended by this. And I went to one of the senior leaders about it. So, I mean, I'm a straight woman myself, but I'm very open-minded. It's like, that's not even an issue for me in life.
No,
so it's kind of like
strange as well when SGI claims to be, very open-minded as an organization. But also, they're making a lot of assumptions, Even Daisaku Ikeda's making a lot of assumptions about you actually wanting to marry and wanting to marry a man. And, wanting to find a suitable part. Like, maybe you just don't want any of these things. Maybe you don't want to get married, or maybe you don't want to marry a man, or maybe you just, want to be on your own, which is also absolutely okay. It's very strange.
Single is fine too.
Yeah. But we
I embraced my singleness. Yes. I embraced my singleness for a while, so...
Yeah, which I think is important for everybody to do, just to kind of find your own way independently a bit. But that's easier said than done when we're talking about a lot of these high control groups, especially when they are like, the Unification Church, for example, setting up couples from different countries to kind of allow this network of trafficking almost to take place. So with these mass arranged weddings of international people. But we should have really talked about this at the start of the episode, and we're kind of almost coming to the end now, but we're going to throw it in anyway.
Yeah.
When it comes to SGI, we've talked a little bit about where SGI came from, how it originated, what the teachings are based in, but what are the actual beliefs and practices of SGI as you understood them kind of from the age of 4 onwards into when you were in leadership positions? What is your understanding of the beliefs and practices of SGI?
I think SGI uses a real form of Buddhism from thousands of years ago as kind of a foundation of what the SGI evolved into, which was, I believe, a narcissistic control group. I think they use those teachings as almost a front to what is actually going on in the organization itself. I think that Daisaku Ikeda was quite self-inflated as an individual, and he had turned a very sort of legitimate Buddhist teaching or sutra practice into something completely different. I think it was under the guise of Buddhism, where it actually was a group for him, for his self-aggrandizement and his ability to become so financially prosperous, as many people have seen throughout the years. He did pass away, I believe, last year, officially. He, I guess, didn't want the members to see him for so long in public, because that would have been the exact opposite of what people would remember him being, as sort of this almost messianic figure, father figure.
I think there are also some claims along the way that the SGI was supposed to be healing and that you couldn't get sick as well. So that would be kind of like counter the claims that he had made, if he himself, as the leader, who was someone who was meant to be divine, was actually suffering from multiple strokes.
Yes, and it deformed his facial features, and he became, I believe he was amputated from the knees down later on in life, because he was so sick. I mean, his body was really shutting down in his later years. I mean, he lived into his 90s. And it's ironic too, you know, when my mother died, I had to have a funeral for her. She died at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020, and I had to follow her last wishes because I was her executor. So I had to arrange a small memorial service of 10 people that she requested to be at her funeral. And guess what? They were all SGI members. I had to face these people again after so many years of being apart from them. Like, I decided to disconnect myself from all of them, you know, because it basically ruined my life in various ways. You know, it isolates you from real world people that are outside of the organization. So you have to learn on your own how to be a healthy, normal, quote, person on the outside after you leave in your mid-20s. It's like you have to find your identity again as a human being and what you want, and, you know, have your own freedom, basically. But I had to look at all these people who were like, some of them had died already, so they couldn't be in attendance. They were elderly at that time when I was growing up. So, but these leaders that I knew on a very close basis, and some that I had even clashed with, they had to be at her memorial service, right? And a lot of them were looking at me like, oh, we really, really miss you. All this blah, blah, blah about coming back to the organization now that mom and dad are both dead, you know? And it was so uncomfortable, Kacey. I mean, she had her object of worship and this expensive teak wood altar box inside of her house. And of course, my brother couldn't be here to execute her final wishes with me because he lives halfway across the world in a different country, and he has health issues now because he's older than me. So he couldn't be here for that, and I had to take care of the whole estate. So I was emptying out her house, and I was looking at her butsudan, which is where the object of worship scroll is hanging, and I was standing in front of it. I remember this very clearly, looking at it, going, what am I going to do with this now? Right?
Yeah.
Because it was like bad memories for me. Traumatic, right? So I had to call one of her friend leaders at the time back in 2020, and everybody was wearing a mask and it was horrible. And I said, could you please come to my mother's home and pick this up and take it away? I said, I don't want to keep it. And he looked at me when he came over and he says, are you sure you don't, like, this is kind of a memory of your mom? And I said, yeah, Craig. I said, it's like, you know, it's not a really great memory, so I need you to take this away and send it. Or I said, you know what, why don't you give it to like one of the up and coming leaders? I'm sure they would really appreciate having this. So yeah, he took it away. He had one of the members come by with a big truck, and they loaded it on and they took it away. And then we had to send the scroll back to Japan somewhere. I have no idea where it went. But after her funeral stuff was over, it was like they were just completely shunning me anyway. Like, I mean, I was shunned when I left, but after my mother's funeral, which is a difficult time for anybody, right? Because even abused children as adults, they still have feelings towards that parent, right? So it's not an easy time. You have mixed feelings all over the place. And it's like when I saw them driving away, I thought, oh gosh, I hope I never see these people ever again. I don't need this, right? So then one of them called me, the women's division started calling me. 3 leaders called me after her service was over and everything was kind of done. And they said, oh, you were such a good member before, and we really want to see you come back to meetings. Are you sure you don't want to come back? I can come visit you. And I said, thank you. I really appreciate the effort and, the caring, but it's not real caring, Kacey. Like this group is so good at being fake. I have to say fake because it's such a glib, superficial kind of caring. It's
Right.
a superficial charm that they put on in order to entice people into the group itself. And then once you're in there, it's like you are so regimented into doing activities and meetings and chanting for hours and hours a day, which gradually changed. Like they went from an hour and a half to 2 hours or more down to like, say, 20 to 30 minutes nowadays in 2024. So they kind of cut that shorter because I guess people were complaining about it too much. But, the chanting and all the stuff you had to do voluntarily for the organization and for Daisaku Ikeda was so overwhelming that I would strongly advise people to, if anybody wants you to join their high control organization, they're not going to come across as being high control at first in the beginning, because I find organizations like this are narcissistic and they're run by very narcissistic leaders. And I had run-ins with a lot of these leaders, senior leaders to me when I was a young woman there in SGI Canada, that I was just bamboozled completely by it. I thought, wow, these people and my mom have a lot in common, right? Their attitude towards people and life, the control, the amount of neglect, the trying to appease people by giving you a lot of platitudes that mean nothing really under the surface. So the caring was a superficial caring, even at my mom's death, at her service, which was very limited. And it was like they were all nice to me during the service and everything. But after I basically told all of them after the service was over, I said, I am never coming back to SJI Canada, and you really need to respect that.
Yeah.
And I said, you do what you do. I said, if it works for you, great. Please continue to do so. But I said, please, I do not want to hear from any of you in the future until I die, basically. I told them that, like with these arranged marriages between, Japanese people and other Japanese people and non-Japanese people and all kinds of people that were never supposed to, I think, be coupled together. That was so disturbing to me. And being told that I had to marry, I had to find somebody within the organization, I should hang out more with people in the organization. Well, yeah, but I'm the only one that's kind of in the middle. I'm not quite an adult, and I'm not like a toddler-aged child either. I'm stuck in the middle somewhere because of the year I was born in. And then being told that I wasn't allowed to ask questions. And, well, this is the way we've always done it, and this is the right way of doing things. And so I wanted to tell you briefly about how I was guilted into staying. And it was mostly by my mother and the Japanese, more traditional, older members of this organization. It's a word called bachi, and it's spelled BATCHI in the English, and it's punishment. It's called punishment. Punishment is, and I'll give you a list of things that would be considered punishable: asking too many questions and making a scene at the meetings. 2, you're not chanting enough. If you only chant more, you will be much happier, and that's all the things that you want in your life are going to come true for you. Even if you got stage 3 or stage 4 cancer, I think you'd be able to overcome this sort of illness by chanting a lot more. That's another thing.
Yeah.
That's very, very oppressive. Thirdly, you would get bachi if you left the organization. Okay, punishment. And it wasn't like a punishment from really SGI Canada. It was some sort of ethereal punishment that was out there somewhere. It's like some force of nature was going to make you miserable, unhappy. You would get really bad luck. You would be cursed in some way if you did any of the above list that I just gave you.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was really, really horrible. And to say so pridefully that this is the only way to attain true happiness and enlightenment is poppycock. It's utter nonsense. I think that we're all part of a collective consciousness. We are human beings. We're spiritual beings having a human experience on this earth. That's what I feel personally. And that we are all just beings here. We are experiencing life, right? And because we're all individual souls, we need to figure out what works best for us on an individual level.
Absolutely. And it's so nefarious to exploit someone's spirituality in that way and make it as though you are the only solution to a whole magnitude of really blurry problems, like nothing definitive, like this sort of thing might happen or that sort of thing might happen. And the only thing that can save you from those things that maybe, sort of might happen, this is this chanting and this belief and attendance with SGI. And I wanted to ask if you could just talk through the listeners briefly or remind listeners who have listened to the earlier SGI episodes, what is the chanting and why is it significant and what does it have to do with another Buddhist chant that is not quite the same as this Buddhist chant?
Well, SGI Canada chants Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, which is the name of the Lotus Sutra, which is a real sutra from over 3,000 years ago. It originally came from India in Sanskrit. Most of it is in Sanskrit. And as it evolved and sort of made its way over to China and Japan, in the end, it became, it was an obscure form of Buddhism that was taken up by Nichiren Daishonin, who was an ordinary man. He was a fisherman, and he took this teaching and he said, if you chant the name of this sutra, which is Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, in Japanese, it was taken from Sanskrit originally, then you will attain enlightenment. But there's more to it than that. The Lotus Sutra is quite a long sutra itself. It is a very complex form of teaching that really does exist, and I have looked into it and realized, yes, this is a legitimate form of Buddhism. However, the way it's being practiced by SGI all over the world is, I would even call it a bastardization of the original sutra. I have to put it that strongly because the way the organization comes across is that, yes, you have to know about the Buddhist teachings, but the way it's being practiced is totally under Daisaku Ikeda's leadership and guidance, right? It has nothing to do with the priests or anybody that's, really knowledgeable and really well practiced in the actual original form of Buddhism itself. And they did change the chant. You're very right about that. The first word should be Namu instead of Nam. And when you look at words are very, very important. And the way they are translated also is very, very important. And when you take even one syllable or even a vowel out of an original Sanskrit word like that, it actually changes the meaning, right? So they cannot tell people that this is what you should be chanting and it's the only thing you should be chanting because it's the only way to your enlightenment and your wisdom and your true happiness. That is false. That is completely false. Excuse me, but you know what? There's all kinds of practices in this world where people can practice and they can reach enlightenment. So that's BS, basically.
I agree.
And even if you don't practice anything at all, it's okay too.
Yeah. I mean, that's my stance, definitely. And I think it's interesting to read different forums and different perspectives on people that do practice Buddhism and different types of Buddhism, because sometimes SGI will be given the cult label just because of the chant being different to the original chant. And that's very similar to how people in different branches or sects of Christianity will call other branches and sects of Christianity cults because they follow, like they don't follow the Trinity or like whichever specific difference a group wants to pick up on
Mm-hmm.
and say that's why this Christian group is a cult. It's very similar
Yeah.
with what happens in the Buddhist space when it comes to people that practice Buddhism talking about SGI. But what you've
Yeah.
talked about here is really a lot more in terms of exploiting people for their time, exploiting people for their free labor, for their money,
Money.
exploiting people's spirituality and beliefs and using those to control people. And
Yeah.
oftentimes on my SGI interviews on YouTube, I get a lot of people that comment and say, SGI is great, SGI is amazing, I've never had any of these experiences. Like that's great. I'm sure that there are a lot of people out there
Right.
that have never had these these negative experiences, or at least are not in a place where they will allow themselves to recognize that they've had these abusive experiences. But what you've
Right.
explained here today is that, some people say, oh, yeah, they ask you to do a lot, but you could just say no. And that is not true.
Yeah.
And I
That's
wondered
not
if you
true.
could just end the episode today by letting everybody know, whether
Yeah.
it's current members of SGI that are listening, whether it's former members and survivors of SGI that are listening, or whether it's just listeners in general, why
Mm-hmm.
it is that you cannot say no, or you cannot just leave like the big old misconception would lead us to believe.
Right. Okay. There is a reason for that, because I think when President Ikeda was alive, he's been deceased for over a year now. I think these were just rules made up by him and I guess the men in his leadership, so to speak, in a patriarchal country of Japan, which still needs to catch up a lot in its equal rights movements, right? I think these are rules imposed by a person that felt like he was the one to save others. And this happens in a lot of these high control organizations and cults included, where a leader that's in the top position, and it's all top down, of course, which I warn people, if anything is that top down, you got to be careful. You better start questioning that, because there's something wrong with that from the very get-go. So he decided to make up these rules, right? And he was even in a falling out with the actual priesthood of the real Nichiren Shoshu sect of Buddhism, by a priest who is now deceased also. His name was Nikken Shonin. And the reason why he separated the priesthood from the lay organization, which is SGI International, is because he realized that President Ikeda was all about himself and growing his own organization, which was based on material prosperity. Mostly it was about controlling the members and how they practice Buddhism and how they look at things, how they behave even, that he was so disgusted by that he basically excommunicated SGI International from the original Buddhist organization, which is in Japan. They still have a temple, right? They still have Taiseki-ji Temple in Japan. It's in Tokyo now, but it has nothing to do with SGI at all. SGI is about forming an organization by a man who I think became too egotistical in his own practice, so to speak, and his vision became what was considered proper for SGI, which was the organization he created, really. I mean, he took it from two other leaders before him who had died. They were deceased, and he made it into something else. He turned it into something else. What started off as, I think, good ideas, right? Which is individual happiness, world peace, developing yourself and attaining enlightenment and wisdom and the highest spiritual levels that you can attain as a human being. I think those are all wonderful things. Yes, they are. But making people, like putting them into this box where everything is so structured and organized and you must do this, you can't do that. And even though the pressure is like kind of a passive aggressive kind of pressure, it's still there. It wears on your thinking. It wears on you psychologically and emotionally, to the extent where if you're a person who thinks for themselves and you're a critical thinker, you're not going to be in there too long. You're not going to be happy with that. I can be honest and say that to you. If you're a person who needs to belong somewhere, maybe you came from a really crappy family background or something. Maybe you were an orphan as a child. You have this need for having a family to feel comfortable with. If you're a conformist naturally, then you'll probably like the SGI in a lot of ways, right? But for people who see what's going on under the surface, and I'll tell you, the higher you get in leadership, the more stuff you're going to see, whether it's good or bad.
Yeah.
And for people to be arranged in marriages, for instance, in our group, I was looking at that thinking, this is unacceptable. Not only is that a medieval practice from ancient times, which no longer fits into our contemporary world, it takes away people's freedom. It's like, oh, but if you marry somebody that practices with you, you're going to be happier and you'll attain enlightenment faster and you'll do it as a couple, which is a lame excuse. It's like, excuse me, but you're putting conditions on people. You're actually telling people who to marry and who you can't. And you have to marry. It's like, what if people don't want to marry? I have friends who've never been married and they're happy. It's like, there's nothing wrong with that either. So anywhere where you're not allowed to question, where you're not allowed to think for yourself, where you're not allowed to do the things that are right for you as an individual human being, get out of there fast. I say don't walk, you should run. Because whenever anybody tells you this is the only way, they can't explain everything to you properly. If they tell you this is the way it's always been done, well, you need to run away from that because they're never going to give you a straight answer. They're not going to be really honest. And superficial charm it works on people for a while, but if you're really your own person and you're secure as an individual, you're not going to buy that for very long. And I think that's good if you don't buy it for very long. You need to get away from anything out there in the world that's too controlling and it's too black and white. Black and white thinking is very dangerous, I think. So I just want to put that out there. If you're thinking of joining the SGI, okay, take a look at it, but be critical in your thinking. Ask questions. Think for yourself, because if they start telling you that you shouldn't be doing this or thinking that, you really should maybe not join an organization that says any of those things or makes you do certain things or makes you get away from the things that you want to do. I mean, I had to give up some of my friends growing up in this organization because they were Christians. And another thing is that you are not allowed in SGI Canada to attend any other religious ceremonies, events, or look at their teachings either. That is very, very frowned upon. And I have to be honest about that. That to me it came across to me as a teenager, especially, that's very narrow-minded. And it's like, why can't you learn about other people's stuff? I think you should learn about as many things as you want to in this world, because that actually contributes to your happiness and your growth as a person.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's very well said. And some nicer sentiments to take away from a conversation that's been kind of centered around control, and even just control through social proof and conformity, because, saying no to doing something in SGI when you're at a certain position will result in, I imagine, some more sour confrontations from some of your and other members of SGI. But this has definitely been a conversation that has given a totally new perspective what we've heard about before from previous survivors that have come on to speak about SGI. And I know that the ex-SGI community who are so active and so supportive of this podcast will be really thankful to hear another installment on this show regarding Soka Gakkai International and just what it's like for children being raised into this particular movement. So thank you so much, Jay, for your time, for coming here and talking us through so eloquently about your experiences in SGI and what SGI is.
Thank you, Kacey. It's been a pleasure speaking with you so candidly and honestly, and it's helped my growth as a human being. Being in this organization for such a long time has really taught me a lot in difficult ways, challenging ways, but also good ways as well, because it really taught me how not to be as a human being as well as being, right? It has opened my mind to the world itself, being a person in this world as an adult now. And yes, I've had to make new friends. That took time. I'm still making new friends at my age. I am actually in my 50s now. But I've kept my youthful spirit, and not because of being a part of SGI Canada, but finding out who I am as a woman, as a human being, and living my life as I see fit. And I think you need to define your own happiness. I think that's the way to real happiness, really, because it does come from inside you.
Love that so much. That's such a lovely and empowering statement to end on today, Jay. Thank you so much for your time, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yes, you too. Enjoy life and enjoy your day, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you. If you ever want to speak outside of the podcast, I welcome that. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. Let's keep in touch.
Yes, let's do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.